Have you heard about these camps in Australia? Is it right? Is it wrong? What's going on in Australia? And when do we start to examine the human rights angle here and consent of the governed? Hello there, you 4.5 million wonders from all across the world, wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever you want, whatever you believe in, you are welcome here. Let's talk about news truthfully and honestly and openly, recognizing we don't have all the answers, but together we can discover at least some of the questions. If you're in the UK between January and May, come see me live. There's a link in the description. I'm at the Hammersmith Apollo in London, early February 2022. Come see me, it'll be great. You won't be going nowhere if you're in Australia though. You can't move a muscle. Let's have a look. Stavroula Pabst and Max Blumenthal in the grey zone, right? Though statewide lockdowns have eased in Australia, the country is constructing internment camps for those who test positive for COVID, along with their COVID negative close contacts. Harley Hodgson, an Australian held for 14 days in one such camp despite repeatedly testing negative for COVID, said of her experience, "You feel like you're in prison, you feel like you've done something wrong. It's inhumane what they're doing." I suppose that the argument is that the coronavirus is so lethal, so deadly, any measures necessary in order to protect human life must be taken. Some people would contest that that brings to the forefront a lot of questions about liberty, the standard of life, potential hypocrisy in other areas. Are we always concerned about preserving and respecting human life? And what about the qualitative component of life? I don't know. These are questions for all of us to consider in a free democracy, particularly one in which I have no opinion, as you know. Bridget Delaney in The Guardian writes, "With the pandemic, more of us than ever have felt the bridle of government around our throats. We weren't allowed to leave the country, or if we had left, we weren't easily able to return. And there were limits on gatherings and the ability to protest." Wherever you stand on the evidently and admittedly divisive issue of the pandemic and its accompanying regulations, we must surely start to view this situation through the lens of human liberty, freedom, democracy, and consensus. Or, if we are going to put aside those ideas, surely there should be some curtailment, some statute of limitation on how long these regulations are going to last, how far-reaching they are, how they're enacted, can they be revoked, who imposes them, do the people that impose them obey them, is the evidence sufficient to justify the efficacy of the methods? These are all questions that I would like to see openly discussed in a democracy, not because I have a particular opinion or a particular outcome in mind, but because of my strong belief that true democracy can and must incorporate conversation and is utterly contingent on the consensus of the governed. There were some limits on gatherings and the ability to protest. That was another thing that causes concern, isn't it? If you can't protest against something, what does that suggest? For some, this tight feeling occurred because of border closures. For others, hotel quarantines. For people with young kids, it might have been when playgrounds closed in Melbourne. While for others, the discomfort came with increased policing, large fines, a curfew, limits on freedom of movement, or being stopped and questioned by police about where you lived and how long you'd been outside your house. I mean, just even as a list, can you set aside any particular political allegiance or cultural ideology that you might feel personally aligned to and just think, playgrounds closed, increased policing, large fines, curfew, limits on freedoms of movement, being stopped and questioned by police? Like, is there no situation where you would consider that a problem? People in non-white communities will be more familiar with this feeling of being over-policed. But for many in the suburbs, the experience of being policed and fined without direction was novel and unwelcome. It made them aware, some for the first time, of their civil liberties. They asked, are my liberties or rights being infringed by these emergency powers? It certainly feels so. And if it feels so, what can I do? And where and who do I appeal to? Again, democracy suggests that the institutes in place that are funded by us, which are voted for by us, are beholden to us and will respond and engage in discourse with us. Not like is going on in my country. You have people turn up on the news behind a podium in a mask behind a screen or whatever and say, yeah, you're going to have these lockdown regulations, only to learn that they're not obeying them themselves. Then in America, there's loads of examples of people in positions of power, California governor having parties and, oh, we were wearing masks or whatever. It just feels like, really, you are not subject to the conditions that you are willing to impose on others. That, for me, is a very challenging and dangerous precedent. During the pandemic, civil liberties and human rights were invoked in such a wide range of situations. For other countries with a more libertarian view of human rights, Australia's heavy use of emergency powers and large number of restrictions was noted with disapproval. There were protests outside the Australian consulate in New York, and an article in The Atlantic asked how long could a country maintain emergency restrictions on its citizens' lives while still calling itself a liberal democracy. Australia has been testing the limits. Are you in Australia? Is that how you feel? Are you an Australian abroad, unable to go back home? Do you love and care for people in Australia? I'd put myself in that category and have concerns on that basis. Are you concerned that this is some kind of globalist pilot scheme being checked out in Australia, a more manageable and geographically dislocated population, so that it can later be enacted in other civilizations with the proven efficacy of the ability of the media to manage the situation and suppress protest? Whichever of those categories you fit into, it's certainly worth having a conversation about it. Australia's established human rights and civil liberties groups were busier than ever, but also coming under fire for not doing enough. In May 2021, the Sydney Morning Herald ran an article headlined "Missing in Action: What Happened to the Civil Liberties Movement?" Journalist Osman Faruqi, who collected data during the pandemic on over-policing, said, "In the first 12 months of the pandemic, there was so much anxiety and fear, but the thing that surprised and disappointed me most was that there wasn't a greater pushback on the restrictions without clear health advice, like the curfew. Civil rights groups should have been as vocal as possible, but there was a deep, deep reluctance to do that from the NGO sector and politicians, as they didn't want to be unsupportive of the public health narrative. As time has gone on, those groups and politicians have found their voice again." Well, that's something. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, all of us were frightened and concerned in a deeply personal and collective way for our more vulnerable relatives, for ourselves, whatever category you fit into. So little was known. But it does seem to me that a conversation and policy and government are things that evolve, and they evolve like human beings in response to their environment, their conditions, to knowledge and information. That when regulations are set and inflexible, that is a problem and only advantages one group, the already empowered, and those that operate above the limitations that they impose. Civil liberties groups said they have been very busy, even if they were rarely successful, in litigating for a rollback of extraordinary government powers. It was shouting into the void, says Pauline Wright, president of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties. More policing and more rules have meant that more people are querying their rights, as Hugh de Kretser, exec director of the Human Rights Law Centre, says. Before this pandemic, for many people living safe, comfortable lives, rights violations were things that happened to other people in other places. The pandemic changed that. People who never had to worry much about police were suddenly being stopped and fined for driving to an exercise location. A pregnant woman was arrested and handcuffed in front of her family over a Facebook post. Many people have had a taste of the kind of policing that Aboriginal people and migrants have been experiencing for decades. Perhaps all of us live on a kind of scale of privilege. Certainly many people offer this argument. I recognise as a person with access to financial means that if something happens to me, for example, let me take a pretty ordinary example. If I get a parking ticket, it ain't the end of the world. That's like at the ordinary level of the difference between not having money, like when I was born, and having money like I got now. So I can see, I remember when I was poor, shit, you best do what you're told. I remember that feeling, or you've got to stay well out of the way. Now, something like the pandemic, the reach is so severe, so intrusive, so dominant, that we really have to start to query the impact of regulation on our lives, because less and less of us are in a position to be able to bypass it financially. That don't mean it weren't wrong when it was just poor people or people from groups that are historically persecuted were being persecuted already. Of course that's wrong, of course it is. But now what's being revealed is, there's no limit to how far that can go. They'll just continue to do that as long as it meets the demands that the interests of the powerful require. The Human Rights Law Centre is now running a campaign for a Charter of Rights in Australia. Australia is the only Western democracy without a national charter. Australia has an incomplete patchwork of laws that protect our rights. How Australian. Right, okay. We got here our cherished, incomplete patchwork of rights. What does it say there about locking people in their homes? Don't know. There's just a little bit of checkered stuff and paisley over that. We hope that out of this pandemic, there's far greater awareness of the need to fix this by having an Australian Charter of Rights that puts values like equality, freedom, respect and dignity at the heart of government action, says de Kretser. Well, if you're going to have human rights, if you're going to honour humanity, if you're going to see us as somehow discrete from nature, though I of course believe we're part of it, but we obviously have separate requirements and civilisations and architecture and art and science and all these things, then The reason is because there are inherent or certainly essential human qualities. And if those things exist, if indeed we have souls, even if you regard that from a materialist and secular perspective, a kind of worth, then we have to be treated a certain way and you can't just discard it when it's convenient. Surveys have shown a big uptick in support for an Australian Charter of Rights over the pandemic. This is likely coming from people who haven't had to worry about their rights before and who are suddenly asking how their rights are protected and realising the gaps that exist. The pandemic has forced people to think about human rights. Part of a national charter would be the opportunity to articulate exactly what we mean by human rights. A national bill of human rights is needed for a number of strong reasons, but an initial one is to make any national conversation around rights coherent. We need to work out what human rights look like before we fight for them. While the pointy bit of this aspect of the pandemic might be over, precedents have now been set in how much we will tolerate when it comes to government intervention. A charter at least will help in defining some boundaries. That's certainly what's required. Most of us have an intuitive sense of human rights, personal freedom, collective freedom, right to worship, right to do what we need to do without hurting other people. All these kind of things seem to come quite innately or naturally to us, even though of course there is some culturation and some inflection based on where you grew up, who you're from, where you're educated. There's no denying that. There would be no way of knowing that, would there? Let's face it, due to the phenomenon of subjectivity. But one thing we all know is that we seem to have some sense of justice. We seem to have some sense of what's right and what's wrong. And it's difficult not to feel that sense stirred when you're watching what's happening in Australia right now. So those of you in Australia, Australians everywhere around the world, we love you, we support you. Please let us know what we can do for you. That's my perspective. What's yours? Hit me up in the comments below. Give us a thumbs up, give us a like, pass this around, share it with your friends. Let's get this conversation rocking along. How does this make you feel? Do you think this is being used as some sort of globalist pilot? How do you approach ideas like this yourself? If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one. We go a little deeper in that one. And if you want to learn more about meditation, I do 3 videos a week on spirituality on the Awakening Side channel. Please sign up to my mailing list so I can stay in communication with you. From January to May next year, I'm all over the UK. Get your tickets now. Come see me live. Stay free.